The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was on my second cup of coffee and watching the news. I remember that part clearly because the meteorologist had just said something about a cold front moving through, and I thought, finally, the humidity's been brutal. Then my phone buzzed on the counter. My daughter-in-law's name lit up the screen. That was unusual. She never called me directly. In 4 years of marriage to my son, Carol had maybe called me a handful of times, always to ask for something, never to just talk. So when I saw her name, I already felt something tighten in my chest. I answered anyway. "Hi, Carol." "Hi." She didn't say my name. She never did. "I'm just calling because we need to talk about the landscaping invoice. You said you'd cover it this month and it's already past due." I stood there with my coffee mug halfway to my mouth. "Good morning to you too," I said. She didn't respond to that, just waited. The invoice she was talking about was for the lawn service at the house I owned. The house I let my son Marcus and his wife live in rent-free for the past 3 years. I paid the utilities. I paid for the landscaping. I'd paid to have the kitchen remodeled when Carol said the cabinets were embarrassing. 2 years ago, when the furnace died in January, I drove 4 hours in the snow to hand them a check so they wouldn't have to wait. The invoice was $340. "I'll take care of it," I said, because that's what I always said. She hung up without thank you, without goodbye. Just hung up. I set my mug down and stood at my kitchen window for a long time. I need to back up, because none of this makes sense without knowing how we got here. Marcus is my only child. His mother, my wife Helen, passed away 17 years ago from ovarian cancer. He was 19. I was 51, running a small commercial real estate business I'd spent 20 years building from nothing. 2 office buildings in Raleigh, a strip mall in Cary, a few residential rental properties scattered around the county. When Helen died, something in me broke in a way I didn't fully understand for a long time. And I think what I did, what I know now was wrong, was try to fill the hole by making sure Marcus never struggled, never wanted for anything. I told myself it was love. Maybe it was in the beginning. But I kept doing it long after it stopped being love and started being habit, or guilt, or fear of losing the one person I had left. Marcus went to NC State, and I paid every cent. He graduated with a degree in business and moved back home. And I gave him a job doing property management for 2 of my buildings. Light work. Flexible hours. I paid him $60,000 a year and didn't ask much in return. He was good with tenants, charming in a way I never was. I thought maybe he'd grow into the business over time. Then he met Carol. She was from Charlotte, came from money. Or at least her family acted like they did. Her father drove a Mercedes and wore a Rolex and talked loudly at restaurants. Her mother collected charitable board positions the way some people collect shoes. They were the kind of people who made you feel slightly underdressed even when you were wearing a blazer. From the start, I could see Carol sizing things up. Not people. Things. She'd walk through a room and her eyes would move around it like she was appraising inventory. I noticed it the first time Marcus brought her to Sunday dinner. I told myself I was being uncharitable. That's what you tell yourself. They dated for 2 years, then Marcus called and said they were getting engaged, and he asked if I could help with the ring. Carol had picked one out. It was $22,000. I didn't say what I was thinking, which was, that's more than some people make in a year. I said I'd help. I wrote a check for $15,000 and told Marcus to cover the rest himself. He came back a week later and said he was a little short. Could I do the full amount? I did the full amount. Then came the wedding. They wanted a venue outside Asheville, a restored barn property in the mountains. Very popular, very booked. The catering, the photographer, the florist. I wrote the checks. Total came to just under $68,000. Carol's parents contributed $5,000 and acted like they'd funded a moon landing. After the wedding, they needed a place to live. I had a 4-bedroom house in a good neighborhood in Wake Forest that had been a rental property. Good tenants had just moved out. I told Marcus they could live there while they got on their feet. 3 years later, they were still there, Marcus had stopped coming into the office regularly about 18 months in. He said he was exploring other opportunities. I kept paying his salary anyway. Old habit. So by the time Carol called me about that $340 landscaping invoice, I was somewhere north of $200,000 in over the 3 years of their marriage alone. Not counting the ring. Not counting the wedding. Not counting the wedding. Not counting the decade of support before Carol ever entered the picture. I'd never once asked for a thank you. But that morning, standing at my kitchen window after she hung up on me, I finally admitted something to myself that I'd been pushing down for a long time. I wasn't helping my son anymore. I was funding a lifestyle for 2 adults who had stopped pretending to appreciate it. The thing that broke it open happened 3 weeks later. My brother Walt called on a Saturday afternoon. Walt is 2 years younger than me, lives over in Durham, and he's the kind of man who says exactly what he thinks without drama or decoration. He called to tell me something he'd seen on Facebook. Marcus and Carol had gotten married. I didn't understand at first. They'd been married for 3 years. I'd been at the wedding. Walt said, no, I mean, they had a vow renewal. Or, I don't know. That's what they're calling it. But the photos say our wedding day. There were hundreds of people there. Looked like a real ceremony, tuxedo and gown and everything. I pulled up the photos on my phone. They were public. It was not a vow renewal. It was a full wedding. Second wedding. Ceremony, reception, dinner, dancing. Photos showed at least 150 guests. A venue I recognized, a private estate in Hillsborough that I knew rented for several $1,000s. Floral arrangements that must have cost more than some people's car payments. A photo booth. A live band. Marcus was in a white tuxedo. Carol was in a different gown, not the one from 3 years ago. Neither of them had mentioned a word of this to me. I scrolled back through the photos slowly. Walt stayed on the line and didn't say anything, which is the most respectful thing he could have done. I found a photo of Carol's parents at the head table, champagne glasses raised. I found a photo of Marcus's college friends, a group of 8 or 10 of them, laughing in the photo booth. I did not find a single photo that included me or Walt. I set the phone down on the kitchen counter. Did they invite you? I asked Walt. No, he said. I nodded even though he couldn't see me. Okay, brother, Walt said. You doing all right? I'm fine, I said, and I meant it, actually, which surprised me. I wasn't angry yet. It was more like something very cold and very clear had settled into the center of my chest. Like when the fog finally lifts and you can see exactly where you are, and the view is not what you hoped, but at least it's real. I'll call you later, I said, and hung up. I called Marcus that evening. He answered on the 3rd ring, and I could hear music in the background. Voices. They were still celebrating, I figured. Hey, Dad. What's up? I asked him how the event went. There was a pause. Not long, maybe 2 seconds, but I noticed it. Oh yeah, it was great. Really nice evening. I asked what the occasion was. Just, a party, celebrating with some friends. I told him that Walt had seen the photos online. Another pause. Longer this time. It was kind of a vow renewal thing, he said, low-key. I said it didn't look very low-key. I said it looked like a wedding. I said there were 150 people in the photos and that Carol was wearing a new gown. He was quiet. I asked why I wasn't invited, he said. And I want to be accurate here because I replayed this many times. He said that Carol had wanted to keep it to a certain crowd, that it was about the vibe, that he hoped I'd understand, that it wasn't personal. I asked if Walt's absence was also about the vibe. He didn't answer that. I said goodnight and told him I loved him. Because I did. I do. And I hung up. I sat in my living room for an hour without turning on any lights. The sun went down and the room got dark and I just sat there. I want to be honest about something because I think it matters. A part of me knew, in that hour, that I had to take responsibility for my own role in all of this. I had written checks without conditions for so long that Marcus had never learned that money comes with weight, that kindness isn't a subscription service. I was his father, and I had failed to teach him the most important things while I was busy making sure he never felt discomfort. That is on me. I own that, but I was 63 years old and sitting alone in a dark living room because my son and his wife had thrown a wedding, a beautiful, expensive public wedding, and decided that I didn't fit the vibe. I turned on the lamp, and I started making some decisions. First thing Monday morning, I called my attorney, a woman named Patricia who'd handled my real estate contracts for 15 years. I told her I needed to make some changes. I told her about the house in Wake Forest, that I wanted to convert it from an informal arrangement to a formal lease, and that I needed the lease to reflect fair market rent. She pulled comparable properties while I was on the phone. Fair market rent for that house in that neighborhood, at that time, $2,850 a month. I asked her to draft the lease. I also asked her to add a clause that required 90 days' notice for termination by either party. I wanted this to be legal and documented and completely above board. I was not going to be the villain in their version of this story. Patricia asked me if I was sure about the amount. I said yes. She said she'd have paperwork ready by Thursday. In the meantime, I called my accountant and told him to stop the automatic payroll deposit to Marcus. He'd been drawing a $60,000 salary for doing, by my honest assessment, about 4 hours of actual work per week for the past year and a half. I told him to process the final paycheck for the current period, and that was it. I want to be clear, I didn't do any of this in anger. I did it methodically, quietly, the same way I'd built the business. One decision at a time. I also sat down that week and wrote Marcus a letter. A real letter, on paper. I told him that I loved him. I told him that I had made mistakes, that I had given without boundaries for so long that I had done him a disservice, and that I was sorry for that. I told him that I was not cutting him off to punish him. I was stepping back because it was time for him to build something of his own, and that would never happen as long as I kept doing it for him. I told him the letter was coming. I told him to read it carefully. I mailed it on Wednesday. The lease arrived Thursday. I drove it over to the house myself. Marcus answered the door. He looked surprised to see me. I almost never just showed up. Carol appeared behind him in the hallway, arms crossed, the way she stood when she was already deciding how she felt about something. I told them I had some paperwork for them to look over. I sat down at their kitchen table. I laid out the lease. Marcus read it first. I watched his face. He got to the rent amount and stopped. "Dad," he said, "this is almost $3,000 a month." I told him that was the fair market rate for the property. "We can't—" He looked at Carol. She was reading over his shoulder now, and her expression had gone very still. "We're not in a position to pay this right now." I told him I understood that this was a change, and that I was giving them 60 days to get things in order before the first payment was due. Carol said, "You're kidding." I told her I wasn't. She said, "We have a life here. You can't just—" She stopped. Started again. "Your son lives here." I said yes, and the lease I prepared would make that arrangement official and sustainable. I'd be happy to work with them on a payment schedule for the first couple months if they needed to transition. Marcus looked at me for a long time. His eyes were doing something complicated. I didn't look away. "Is this about the party?" he asked. I told him it was about a lot of things, and that most of them I'd already explained in the letter I'd sent. I told him I hoped he'd read it. Carol said, "I can't believe this." I picked up my copy of the lease, said goodbye, and left. I won't pretend the next few weeks were easy. Marcus called twice. The first time he was calm, trying to negotiate. Could we lower the rent? Could I reinstate his salary while he looked for other work? Could we talk about this in person? I said we could absolutely talk in person, and I meant it. But the terms weren't changing. The second call was harder. He sounded tired, and for a moment he was just my kid again. 19 years old and scared, and everything in me wanted to fold. Wanted to say, never mind, come over for dinner, I'll take care of it. But I'd been saying that for 30 years, and look where we'd ended up. I told him I loved him. I told him this wasn't the end of our relationship, it was the beginning of a different kind of one. I told him I believed in him, genuinely believed he was capable of building something on his own. And that belief was why I was doing this. He didn't say much. But before he hung up, he said, "Okay, Dad." Just that. "Okay, Dad." I don't know exactly what he meant by it, but it didn't feel like anger. Carol called me separately on the Thursday afternoon. It did not go the same way. She told me I was vindictive, that I was punishing them for not inviting me to a private event, that I had no right to change the terms of an arrangement that I had established. I let her say all of it. Then I told her, very calmly, that the arrangement had never had formal terms, and that my attorney had confirmed there was no legal obligation preventing me from establishing them now, which I had done. I told her the 60-day grace period stood. I told her I hoped they'd be able to make it work. She said, "You'll regret this." I told her I hoped not. She hung up. I sat with that for a minute. The threat of regret. The idea that I should keep writing checks so that I wouldn't regret this someday. And then I thought about sitting alone in my dark living room the night Walt called. I thought about $340 landscaping invoices delivered without a hello. I thought about $22,000 on a ring, $68,000 on a wedding. 3 years of carrying 2 adults who had attended a second wedding without finding a place for me at the table. I thought, I've already been living the version of this story where I said yes to everything. It didn't work out so great either. They didn't pay the first month's rent. I gave it 2 weeks past due before I called Patricia again. She sent the appropriate notice. They called the moving company 6 days later. I know because my neighbor, a retired teacher named Frank who lives 2 houses down, mentioned it in passing when I ran into him at the hardware store. Said he saw a truck on a Saturday morning. Said he hoped everything was okay. I told him everything was fine. I drove past the house that afternoon. The moving truck was gone. The curtains were down. The place had that particular emptiness that houses get when they're between lives. I parked in the driveway and sat for a minute. I'd bought that house 22 years ago. Helen had helped me negotiate the price, sitting next to me at the closing table in a yellow blazer, squeezing my hand when we signed. I'd repainted it twice, replaced the roof, put in new windows 6 years ago. I knew every corner of it. I went inside to check on the condition. They'd left it clean. Better than I expected, honestly. A few scuffs on the walls, one interior door that needed adjustment, the usual wear of 3 years of living. But clean. In the kitchen, on the counter, there was an envelope. My name was written on the front in Marcus's handwriting. Inside was a card, one of those blank ones from a drugstore with a simple design on the front. Inside, in Marcus's handwriting, "Dad, I read your letter. I've been reading it a lot, actually. I don't have the right words yet, but I wanted you to know that I heard you. I'm sorry for more than just the party. I'll call you when I figure some things out. Love, Marcus." I stood in that empty kitchen for a while. Then I locked up, got back in my truck, and drove home. It's been about 8 months now. Marcus did call, about 6 weeks after they moved out. He'd gotten a job, a real one, selling commercial insurance for a firm in downtown Raleigh. Started at the bottom, working for someone else for the first time in his adult life. He sounded different on the phone. Tired in a new way, but also something else. More present, maybe, like he was actually in his own life, instead of hovering above it. He came over for dinner once, alone. Carol didn't come. I didn't ask why, and he didn't explain. We sat on the back porch after dinner and talked until almost midnight. About his mother, mostly. About the business, about what it was like when I was starting out and nothing was guaranteed, and Helen would stay up late with me going over ledgers, both of us trying to figure out how to make the numbers work. He said, "I never knew it was like that. I always thought everything just came easily to you." I told him it never came easily. I told him easy was a story we tell after the fact. He nodded and looked out at the yard. "I have a lot to figure out," he said. I told him he had time, that he was younger than I was when I finally got my footing, that it wasn't too late for any of it. I meant that, completely and without conditions. The house in Wake Forest is rented now to a young couple. Both teachers, early 30s, just had their first baby. They pay on time every month and send me photos of what they've done with the garden. Last week the wife texted to say the rose bushes along the fence came back strong this spring. I told her that was good to hear. Helen had planted those. My brother Walt and I have breakfast together most Saturday mornings now, which is something we'd let slide for years and shouldn't have. He's been after me to travel. Says we should go somewhere, do something, spend money on living instead of always holding it in reserve. He's not wrong about that either. I'm 64 years old, I own my business outright, my house outright, and most of my choices. I sleep well most nights. On the mornings I don't. It's usually because I'm thinking about Marcus, hoping he's okay, hoping he and Carol figure out whatever they need to figure out, hoping the son I raised is still in there somewhere underneath everything I got wrong. I think he is. I think that card on the counter was real. But I also know that I can't want his life more than he does. I know that now in a way I didn't before. You can love someone completely and still have to put down the weight of carrying them. You have to, because if you don't, you'll carry it until you collapse, and then neither of you has anything. Some mornings I sit with my coffee and I think about Helen, about what she'd say about all of this. She was the sharper one of the two of us, always. She'd have seen Carol for what she was long before I did. She'd have set limits early, clearly, with that particular calm she had, the kind that made people understand she was serious without ever raising her voice. But she'd also tell me not to give up on Marcus. She'd say, give him room to surprise you. So that's what I'm doing, giving him room. And if he comes back, really comes back, ready to be in a relationship that goes both ways, I'll be here. I'll be right here. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened. Not in any grand or spiritual way, just the plain, ordinary mechanics of it. You do a thing, and the thing follows. You don't do a thing, and something else follows from that. It's not complicated. It's just easy to ignore when the thing you're doing feels like love. For 30 years, I handed Marcus a softer version of reality. Every time something was hard, I smoothed it down. Every time something cost money, I covered it. I told myself that's what a father does, especially after losing his mother so young. And maybe some of that was true. But somewhere along the way, I stopped doing it for him and started doing it because I didn't know how to stop, because stopping would have meant sitting with the discomfort of watching him struggle, and I wasn't ready for that. So I kept going, and the bill for that, the real bill, not the landscaping invoice, came due the night Walt called, and I sat alone in a dark room looking at wedding photos I hadn't been invited to. That's the thing about avoidance. It doesn't cancel the consequence. It just delays it and adds interest. What I did wrong wasn't loving my son. It was confusing love with rescue. A person who is always rescued never learns they can swim. Marcus got to 34 years old without ever having to figure out what he was made of, because I was always there to make sure he didn't have to find out. That's not a gift. I know that now. It took me too long to know it, but I know it. And Carol. I don't think Carol was purely the villain in this story, even though it's easy to cast her that way. She walked into a situation that had already been built. Marcus had been trained, long before she arrived, to expect support without accountability. She just leaned into what was already there. People tend to do that. They find the open door and walk through it. The door I left open for 20 years. The decision to close it wasn't revenge. I want to be clear about that. When I sat down with Patricia and drafted that lease, when I called the accountant and ended the payroll, I wasn't angry. I was clear. There's a difference. Anger wants to punish. Clarity just wants to stop. I wanted to stop carrying something that was hurting all three of us. And the only way to do that was to actually stop. The hardest part wasn't Marcus's calls. It wasn't Carol's threat that I'd regret this. It was the letter he left on the counter in that empty kitchen. I read your letter. I've been reading it a lot, actually. I stood there holding that card for a long time, because it told me the thing I most needed to know, that he was still in there. That the person I'd raised hadn't disappeared entirely inside the person the years had made him. Intelligence without character is just cleverness. Strength without honesty is just stubbornness. I think the only thing worth building, in a business, in a life, in a son, is the kind of person who can look at a hard situation and choose the harder right thing over the easier wrong one. Marcus is still figuring out how to be that person. So am I, honestly. At 64, I'm still learning. But I think we're both closer than we were. And that's enough to keep going.